I have heard of something called the Big Five, and we mentioned it a little bit before we spoke. But what are these traits, and are they part of a scientific understanding of personality?
Yeah, very much so. Let me give a little bit of historical context to it. In the um, late 60s, early 70s, there was quite a revolution in the field of personality. And a researcher from Stanford by the name of Walter Mischel uh, did a head on attack upon the whole notion of stable traits of personality, which hitherto had been a dominant field of personality science. And he argued that we are not um, best construed as individuals who have stable traits of personality that are predictably related to what we do. Rather, we're much more nuanced than that. And we are situational animals. We are constrained by the situations we are in, or guided or shaped by them. And we may be extroverted on Tuesday and Wednesday, but on Thursday we may not be. And so it's a situation rather than the putative trait that we should take into account. And it's also interesting that Walter was a student of George Kelly's. And so it was not just the situation, it was the personal constructs that individuals use that is better to know than the putative traits that they have. And so these twin forces of Mischel's critique had a big impact on the field of personality. Indeed, it was very difficult for those who subscribed to the notion of traits to get research grants during this period of psychology. And there was quite a degree of animosity that was engendered by this, what I call the great trait debate. But the traitors, as we may call them, ERS, returned. And they returned strong. And one of the things they were able to do, it's very methodological, was to say, look, we can't predict what David will do in situation X. But if we sum across situation X and X1 and X2 and X3 and X4, then we are better able and are able to predict way beyond chance levels and way beyond what Mischel called the personality coefficient of 0.3, up to 0.6 or 0.7. In other words, the methodology that Mischel was using to critique traits was a very insipid methodology. And instead, if we use the correct methodology, you can see that traits are predictive. And there began a whole resurgence of the trait paradigm in the 70s up through the 80s, up to the present day. That if we were to look through most of the contemporary research on personality, with one exception, they would be primarily trait research grounded on the big five or big six dimensions of personality. So if you'd like, we can go through what those are, the big five.
I would, but there are a couple things that I wanted to ask you about that you just mentioned first. So you brought up George Kelly and then personal constructs, which you contrasted with traits. So maybe we should just say what personal constructs are.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked, because a lot of people skip over that, and it's really important that we understand it. Constructs can be looked at as conceptual goggles that we place over our experience. And he argues that they can be captured as adjectives that we use. So I may look at the world in terms of good, bad. That would be a construct that has what Kelly called a broad range of convenience. You can apply that to politicians, good, bad cats, good, bad hypotheses. It has an enormous range of applicability, or convenience is a term George used. Other constructs are more narrowly phrased. Two-stroke, four-stroke applies to certain kinds of internal combustion engines, but don't apply very effectively to elements like grandmothers unless you're using metaphor very wildly. And so the personal constructs are goggles that we try on. They're also implicitly hypotheses. This is a good person. This is a trustworthy person. And we don't just have one pair of goggles, so some people come very close to just having one construct in their system. MAGA, not MAGA. That may be the construct that guides their life. But most people have a variety of constructs that are organized into internal systems. And we can understand, it sounds very intellectualistic. And in fact, Kelly was criticized for having this rather too intellectual view. The fact that it was digital, the fact that it anticipated by 15 years the cognitive revolution is often not acknowledged because, frankly, it isn't studied as much, nor is accorded the historical precedence I think it deserves. But basically, he can show that these are dichotomous, that they can be applied in such a way that we can determine the overall degree of complexity of a personal construct system with many degrees of freedom afforded by many different constructs, or a simple system. When we run factor analyses, which we'll be familiar with, there may be only one factor, good, bad, or good looking, not good looking, or well built, not well built, or went to Stanford, didn't go to Stanford. These may be the constructs that you use. And note that they're not constructs in the loose sense or conceptual sense where we can talk about it in the context of the philosophy of science. They're personal constructs. George Kelly's work is intriguing in that while it was accused of being very intellectualistic, his notion that we live our lives testing out hypotheses as proactive creatures actually had some very interesting and very novel ways of looking at emotions. And he saw, for example, that anxiety is the awareness that an event is outside the range of convenience of your personal constructs. So if you meet someone or you're in a relationship or you confront an event in which it does not appear to be predictable from your constructs, it's just not working for you, then you're going to feel anxiety until you say, that was it. I knew he was a MAGA supporter. Or, of course, now I understand she does love me after all. And so this anxiety is, of course, one of our most basic emotions to be looked at as the result of having insufficient breadth of constructs to handle the incoming stimulation from the world, or the stimulation caused within you coming up, about which you also have to make sense. I thought that was a very distinctive way of looking at it. Another of looking at emotions. And another example, which I think is terribly clever, is the whole notion of what happens when we attempt to extort validation. This is a definition of hostility. When we attempt to extort validation for a hypothesis we now realize has been disconfirmed. That's a very distinctive way of looking at something like hostility. That is, you're going to say, damn it, you do love me. You do love me. You look at all the we've done together. You obviously you love me, don't you? And you can see hostility arising out of the incomprehension that something you were so absolutely sure was predictable, although you had perhaps a feeling that it may not be, has in fact ended up being the way you did not want it to be. Is this the best way of looking at hostility? Perhaps not. I mean, there are other evolutionary and other approaches that you can take. But it's just to show that I think Kelly was brilliant in reformulating from a cognitive perspective things that hitherto had not been looked at in that way. And again, it was one of the reasons I really admired him as a theorist.